Claire Mason, the overlooked younger daughter of the prominent Mason family, shocks her family by revealing she has published a best-selling book, which garners critical acclaim. This revelation sparks a confrontation, as Claire decides to take down the family's public image and expose their hidden secrets and scandals. Over time, her actions lead to the downfall of her siblings and father's legacy, ultimately allowing her to reclaim her place of power and respect. Before we begin the story, if you are new to our channel, please subscribe right away, like the video, and share it with your friends so this story can reach everyone. If you want your name to be included in our upcoming story, make sure to comment your name and the place you are listening from. In our next story, we will mention your name here. So, let's move ahead with our story. The Mason family house looked alive that September evening, its brick walls glowing in the soft wash of fairy lights that draped across the front porch. Cars lined the driveway and spilled onto the suburban street. Laughter, the kind that rises like champagne bubbles, escaped through the half-open windows, carried on the cool autumn breeze. Inside, the dining room had been transformed into the stage of celebration. A three-tiered cake stood proud in the center, vanilla and gold, with delicate roses carved from cream. Around it, polished silverware and crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier. It was a birthday gathering for Gerald Mason, the patriarch, 65 today. He wore the wide smile of a man comfortable under the spotlight, leaning back in his chair as relatives clustered around him like satellites orbiting a sun. But not everyone basked in the glow. On the far edge of the room, just beyond the circle of cheer, sat Claire Mason, his younger daughter, 32 years old, elegant in a navy dress, but deliberately placed at the end of the table. Her chair had literally been shifted away when more important guests arrived, leaving her half in shadow by the kitchen doorway. To the outside eye, it might have looked like oversight. To Claire, it was deliberate. This had always been the Mason family way. Claire, quiet, hardworking, the so-called average one, was destined to be overlooked. Her older sister Julia, a corporate lawyer with her booming voice and showy wardrobe, was celebrated with constant applause. Her brother, Evan, with his real estate empire and flashy cars, was their father's pride. And Claire, the writer, the thinker, the woman who fought through setbacks the rest of them never knew, was always just Claire. On birthdays, weddings, and anniversaries, she sat like this, present but invisible. But tonight would be different. Claire tapped her fingers against the wine glass, steadying her breath as the conversations carried on without her. She overheard Evan boasting about closing another multi-million-dollar deal. Julia was laughing too loud, recounting how her firm had defeated rivals in court. Everyone drank, clapped, cheered. Gerald glowed with pride, nodding along with each story, his smile widening further. Then his eyes finally drifted toward Claire, as though just remembering she was there. "And Claire," Gerald said with a dismissive chuckle, "still working on your little projects, or what do you call it this time? Another essay, another blog?" The table erupted in polite, uncomfortable chuckles. Julia smirked. Evan concealed a laugh behind his napkin.
"Yes," Claire replied calmly, lifting her glass. "Still working on my little project." She didn't need to explain. She didn't need their validation anymore, because tonight she had a plan. All through the meal, the conversations danced around her. They spoke about investment portfolios, political campaigns, new cars, vacations, things that screamed wealth and power. Every so often, one of them would throw Claire a bone. "So, writing anything fun these days?" before turning back to themselves. It had always been this way, but Claire had been changing quietly, in the shadows they left her in. Her past year had been one of reinvention. The stolen hours writing late into the night, waking at dawn to edit, the rejection letters she once cried over eventually replaced with offers she never disclosed. Her book, her real project, wasn't a little blog. It was a cultural bomb that exploded into bestseller lists 3 months back, hailed by critics as ferociously intelligent and a masterpiece of moral bravery. None of them, not Julia, not Evan, not even her father, had bothered to notice. Which was why, as plates were cleared and champagne poured for speeches, Claire straightened her back and felt that familiar spark inside her ignite into flame. When Gerald lifted his glass to thank everyone, Claire waited until the crapping died. She let her fingertips rest lightly against the base of her wine flute. Then she spoke, voice calm, but cutting through the chatter like crystal shattering. "I suppose," Claire said, "it's only fair if I make a toast as well." The room paused. Heads turned. There were half smiles, the kind people gave when they doubted the speaker could be interesting. Gerald chuckled indulgently. "Well, if you must, darling, go ahead." Claire rose from her chair. All eyes reluctantly followed as she stood tall, the shadows falling away from her. Her navy dress glowed deep in the chandelier light. She held no notes, no phone, no rehearsed gesture, only the magnetism of a woman who had been underestimated too long. "For years, we've gathered around this table to celebrate each other's accomplishments. Julia with her legal brilliance, Evan with his financial empire, Father with his legacy of strength and authority. And me, well, in this family's eyes, I suppose, I've always been something smaller." A ripple of discomfort passed over the table. Julia sat up straighter. Evan frowned. Her father gave another chuckle, uncertain now. Claire tilted her head slightly, the faintest smile rising. But the truth has a way of demanding a seat at the table, even when some would prefer to keep it out on the edges. She paused. Silence deepened, charged. Like a storm just before lightning strikes. The distant hum of a dishwasher in the kitchen became audible, the weight of everyone's gaze pressing more heavily on her. As some of you may know, or maybe none of you bothered to notice, I published a book last year. Not a blog, not an essay. A book. Her words snapped sharp, precise. Julia shifted, a frown creasing her forehead. Her brother muttered something under his breath. But Claire continued. That book hit the New York Times bestseller list in 3 weeks. It has been translated into 4 languages. Universities are already teaching it this semester, and just last month, I signed an agreement for the film adaptation. Gasps punctured the air. Evan stared. Julia's mouth parted in faint disbelief. Gerald blinked, his smug smile now frozen, brittle.
Claire raised her glass in their silence. So tonight, while we celebrate Father's legacy, I'll celebrate something else. That despite years of being dismissed, muted, and patronized, I've carved something of my own. Not for your approval, not for your applause, for me, and for anyone who has ever been told their place is on the edge of the table. She clinked her glass lightly, the sound ringing sharp. Then she drank. Nobody spoke. For the first time in Mason family history, silence reigned at the table. Claire sat back down unshaken. She had always been the quiet one, but tonight her words roared like thunder, and it was only the beginning. The silence at the Mason dining table that night lived on long after the champagne glasses were emptied. Gerald Mason, once so animated in his birthday spotlight, now sat stiff in his chair, his forced chuckle dissolving into silence as the weight of Claire's words hung between them. Julia hadn't spoken since the toast, her lips pressed into a thin, hostile line. Evan lingered in disbelief, scrolling through his phone in secret, no doubt trying to verify if his sister's claim about bestseller lists was real. Claire, meanwhile, didn't need to check. She had lived it. She was it. And tonight, she had decided not only to claim her seat at the table, but to dismantle the smug hierarchy her family had built. By the time dishes were cleared and guests began to leave, whispers filled corners of the house. Aunts and cousins glanced at Claire with a new, begrudging respect. Julia's friends avoided eye contact, sensing the storm waiting to break. But the real confrontation came later. Claire. Her name echoed sharply in the study, where Gerald had summoned her after the party ended. The warm lights flickered against the heavy oak bookshelves, casting the old man's silhouette long and imposing. Julia and Evan stood flanking him like lieutenants, arms crossed, expressions cold. Claire leaned casually against the desk, unfazed. "So this was your little game, humiliating your family in front of our guests, turning a birthday celebration into a rare moment of honesty? Yes, I suppose it was." Julia stepped forward, her tone dripping disdain. "You could have shared your success without trying to overshadow everyone else. That was petty." Claire tilted her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Petty? Coming from you, Julia, that's, rich. You've made a career out of overshadowing people, including me." "Don't twist this." Evan's voice rose harshly. "You disrespected Dad tonight. This family runs on loyalty, Claire, not theatrics." She laughed lightly. "Loyalty? Is that what you call it? Funny, I always thought we ran on arrogance, favoritism, and hypocrisy." Gerald's face darkened. "Enough. You think one book makes you superior? You think it erases the years of what? Of you pretending I didn't exist? Of Julia sneering at every accomplishment I managed to scrape together? Of Evan comparing my salary to his newest property like I was a child with lunch money? No, one book doesn't erase that. But it does prove something. I don't need this family to succeed. I never did, and I never will." She pushed off the desk, her presence radiating more power than all three of them combined. Then she paused, leaning closer. "But you," her eyes glittered, "you need me now." Word traveled fast in their circles. The Mason family name had always been synonymous with wealth, business, politics. But now, because of Claire, the name was also tied to the literary world, cultural discourse, television interviews, and rumor mills. The book had opened doors for her, but it also indirectly opened doors for them. Invitations from elite galas hinted they wanted the powerful Mason family whose daughter redefined American literature. Suddenly, journalists weren't calling to talk about Gerald's business empire. They were asking about Claire. It drove her siblings mad. Julia attempted to co-opt the fame, speaking about how she had always known Claire's talent would shine. In interviews, she positioned herself as the supportive sister, though privately, she seethed that strangers cared more about Claire's ideas than her latest courtroom success. Evan grew paranoid, worried Claire's cultural prominence might eclipse his financial stature in social circles. He subtly began undermining her, making corrections about her work at parties, dismissing literature as glorified hobbyism whenever someone praised her. And Gerald? He tried to reassert control, reaching out to arrange dinners, hinting that Claire's success owed itself to the work ethic he instilled in his children. But Claire remembered that night at the table. She remembered the dismissal, the condescension that had nearly buried her whole life. And the longer she watched them squirm, the more a new thought formed, an opportunity. Why settle for simply claiming her seat when she could dismantle the entire table? Revenge didn't arrive as a dramatic strike. It slithered in quietly, subtle as smoke. Claire knew her family wasn't simply prideful. They had secrets. In every wealthy dynasty, cracks existed beneath the glossy portrait, and Claire, outsider though she'd been, had spent years observing. A storm was coming, and she was ready to set the lightning loose. First came Julia. Claire knew about her sister's buried scandal, the courtroom slip-up that could have cost a client millions, if not for quietly manipulated evidence. Julia had told the family it was handled, buried, forgotten. But Claire had evidence, tucked away in a folder on her laptop. Then Evan. For all his boasting, his empire wasn't spotless. In fact, Claire had stumbled onto whispers while writing her book, anonymous tips about illegal zoning deals tied back to his properties. She had dismissed them at first until she did her own research, and what she found was rotten enough to crumble Evan's image entirely. And Gerald, the patriarch who prided himself on discipline and strength, had skeletons locked in his studies drawer. Skeletons Claire had glimpsed as a curious teenager. Old documents from the 1980s, business deals that exploited immigrant workers, cover-ups that kept his legacy clean. No one else in the family knew, but Claire knew. For years, she'd carried those fragments of knowledge like dead weight. Now, for the first time, they felt like power. It began innocently, or so it seemed. At a private fundraiser Julia attended, whispers broke out when a guest mentioned concern over a supposedly buried courtroom mishap. Julia dismissed it with laughter, except the guest referenced details no outsider could have known. Somehow, word leaked. Soon after, small blogs began hinting at legal misconducts. Nothing yet publicly tied to Julia Mason, but the pressure mounted. Meanwhile, Evan's empire faced heat from investigative journalists. Not mainstream yet, just community papers sniffing about zoning scandals. But the timing was too perfect. Reports surfaced just days after Claire gave a high-profile interview discussing truth, justice, and corruption in America's elite families. And Gerald? He noticed articles resurfacing about exploitative corporations in the late 20th century. Articles updated with suspiciously specific information. One by one, their polished facades began cracking, and Claire, from her loft apartment in Brooklyn, sipped her wine while watching the storm gather. Weeks later, Gerald summoned the family again. This time, it wasn't for a birthday. It was for control. He demanded his children gather in the mansion again, believing he could regroup them, salvage their unified image. The table looked the same as before: polished silver, glittering chandeliers, food arranged perfectly. But the atmosphere was heavy, brittle. "You're both being careless," Gerald barked to Julia and Evan. "If these whispers keep spreading, they'll ruin us collectively." Julia slammed her glass down. "It's sabotage. Somebody is planting information." Evan sneered, his gaze flicking to Claire across the table. "And we all know who's suddenly benefiting from our downfall." Claire lifted her fork slowly, twirling a bite of pasta, unbothered. "Benefiting?" she repeated softly. "Or just finally being seen, unhindered by the charade that this family is untouchable?" Julia's face hardened. "What do you want, Claire?" For the first time, Claire set her fork down. She leaned forward, eyes glinting in the candlelight. "What I want," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate, "is acknowledgement. What I deserve is respect. What I intend is to make sure this family never silences another voice again, with money, intimidation, or dismissal." Gerald's face flushed. "And how far are you willing to go?" Claire smirked. "You tell me. How much do you think I know?" The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. Each of them realized, perhaps for the first time, that the quiet one at the edge of the table had always been listening, watching, collecting. And now the reckoning had only begun. By late October, the Mason name was no longer just whispered about in glossy charity halls. It was splattered on headlines. The first crack had been Julia. Legal blogs began connecting details of her past courtroom mishap to recent cases, hinting not just at incompetence, but dishonesty. Overnight, her professional reputation trembled. Judges who once treated her as golden grew cold. Colleagues avoided eye contact, and prestigious clients quietly withdrew. Julia raged through phone calls in her glassy law office overlooking Manhattan, her fury so loud that assistants cowered outside the door. But rage couldn't plug a leak. What had been whispered now spread like wildfire, an unstoppable current accelerated by Claire's careful nudging. Then it was Evan. Weeks after Julia's crisis, a feature appeared in a respected investigative newsletter exposing Evan's shady zoning practices. What had once been rumor now had proof. Property exchanged under shell companies, manipulated permits drawn from local officials, and clear exploitation of working-class communities for profit. Investors dropped him. Banks grew hesitant. His empire, shiny but fragile, began rotting from its foundations.
And finally, Gerald, the patriarch who had basked in decades of reverence, now found old ghosts clawing for his legacy. An exposé documented his past empire building, naming immigrant workers exploited under abysmal conditions when his factories thrived in the 80s. Archival photos surfaced, men sleeping in unsafe dormitories, unpaid overtime sheets. Gerald's name, once hailed with admiration, began to drip with the poison of exploitation. No single blow destroyed the Masons at once, but Claire's strikes were surgical. One after another, the family's polished image eroded like marble weathered by acid rain. Claire's world, however, blazed brighter. Her book continued climbing charts, her second already in drafting stages. Magazines placed her on covers, branding her the voice America must hear. Invitations came daily, panels at universities, interviews on late-night shows, keynote speeches about truth and rebellion against systemic corruption. And everywhere she went, when reporters inevitably asked, "How has your family influenced your perspective?" she smiled that sly, quiet smile. Families teach you many things. Some teach you love, others, silence. Mine taught me what happens when voices are buried. My work ensures no voice stays buried again. Audiences erupted with applause. To the public, she became more than an author. She became an avenger of silenced souls. Her family watched bitterly from the shadows. By late November, the once mighty Mason mansion changed. Where weekly gleaming dinners once marked power, there now lingered tension, lawsuits, and hushed arguments. Julia drank more every night, unable to stomach the humiliation of sitting at firm meetings where colleagues whispered behind her back. Evan hired crisis managers, but nothing could stop investors from fleeing. Gerald tried furiously to wield his old influence with politicians and media, but found doors shut, phones unanswered. And Claire? She did not need to set foot in that house again. Not anymore. She orchestrated from afar, sending ripples into the water and watching the sharks circle. But revenge, she realized, wasn't just about destruction. It was about revelation. For years, their perfect image buried truth, silenced consequence. She would not only break them, she'd make the world see them. The final act of the year came on Thanksgiving. Against all expectation, Gerald insisted on maintaining tradition. He declared, "We will appear united," summoning them all to the mansion table one last time. Claire debated her attendance, but decided she couldn't resist. After all, what better stage to reveal the final layer of rot than the very table that had once excluded her? The house looked hollow now, the decorations forced. Staff members had dwindled, several had quit after the scandals. The dining room gleamed as usual, but the laughter was gone, replaced by wary glances and unfinished sentences. When Claire entered, silence rippled. She took her seat, not on the edge this time, but directly across from Gerald, her gaze leveled. The dinner began stiffly, small talk strained. No one mentioned the headlines, though their weight sat on everyone's shoulders. Evan stabbed at his turkey. Julia swirled wine but barely drank. Gerald chewed methodically, trying to project calm. It was Claire who broke the tension. "So," she said lightly, slicing into her potatoes,
I saw the Times piece this morning. Very thorough, Father. They even found that old factory photo. You must have kept it hidden well." Gerald froze. Julia looked at him sharply. Evan muttered, "Jesus, Claire." "What?" she asked innocently. "It's public now."
Julia slammed her fork down. "Why are you doing this? Do you honestly hate us so much you'd burn everything to the ground? We're your blood." Claire leaned back, her voice calm, unshaken. "Exactly. My blood. And what did that mean for the last 32 years? It meant I was invisible, disposable, the one shoved to the corner so you three could shine. Well, now I shine, and the world finally sees the truth of your shine too. The greed, the lies, the rot that propped it up." Gerald's fist struck the table. "Enough. Do you think you'll stay untouchable, girl? You're still a Mason. Do you think the world won't turn on you next?" Claire smiled. Cold, steady. "Let them try. I built myself on truth. You built yourselves on deception. Which do you think survives longer?" The silence that followed was heavier than any before. The chandelier's reflection trembled over crystal glass, the weight of decades of silence now broken. And for the first Thanksgiving in Mason history, Gerald Mason had no words left. When dessert was served, Claire didn't stay. She pushed her untouched pumpkin pie aside, rose, and collected her coat. "I have another dinner to attend," she said simply, heading for the door. "Claire," Julia called after her, desperation cracking her once proud voice. "If you walk out now, you're—" Claire stopped, looked back. "I walked out years ago, Julia. You just never noticed." And with that, she left. Snow had begun falling, dusting the street in white. Claire's car waited at the curb, headlights glowing like a lighthouse in the dark. She slid in, closed the door, and exhaled deeply, watching the mansion shrink in her rearview mirror. They were collapsing. Publicly, privately, entirely. The empire that had once tried to silence her now knelt before her truth. But the question lingered, was this victory? Or would revenge demand more? Claire's smile returned as she gripped the wheel. Whatever it demanded, she was ready. By December, the Mason scandals were no longer murmurs on the edge of society. They were front-page news. The cracks had spread through the marble facade like spiderweb fractures, and now the structure groaned under the weight of its own lies. Claire watched from her Brooklyn loft as the media swarmed, each outlet eager to dissect the rise and fall of America's once untouchable dynasty. She sat by her tall windows, sipping black coffee, the city lights glittering below like constellations. Everything she'd set in motion was gathering speed, and she didn't need to push anymore. The machinery of justice had awakened, and it was hungry. The whispers about her courtroom cover-up now had teeth. A junior associate in her firm, sensing opportunity, leaked internal documents showing Julia's manipulation of evidence. What had been suspicion transformed into scandal. The state bar launched an investigation. Judges she once charmed turned against her, and law journals ran editorials titled "The Hollow Brilliance of Julia Mason." Within weeks, Julia was suspended indefinitely. Her sleek Manhattan office, once a throne of glass and steel, was emptied out with cardboard boxes. For years, Julia had lived for her image, the clothes, the power, the applause. Now the same tabloids that praised her called her a cautionary tale of arrogance. Claire saw her sister's photos online, haggard, eyeliner smudged, wine bottle tucked in her purse as paparazzi snapped away. In another life, Claire might have felt pity, but pity was a coin none of them had ever spared her. Evan's downfall came next, swift and merciless. Investigative journalists dug deeper into his real estate empire. Every deal he thought buried became a headline. Bribed officials, eviction notices for vulnerable families, safety inspections overlooked for profit. The final blow came when federal prosecutors announced a formal investigation into zoning corruption. Court summons arrived with headlines blazing. Real estate mogul Evan Mason under federal scrutiny. Investors abandoned ship overnight. The empire he touted at family dinners, his beloved skyscrapers, condos, and sprawling developments plunged into bankruptcy proceedings. Protesters even gathered outside his office, chanting slogans against corporate greed. Evan, once so boastful, now shuffled into court hearings under lowered caps and sunglasses, his arrogance drowned by legal fees and public shame. Claire watched, unflinching. His towers of glass were falling, and she, once shoved into corners, stood in the open light. But the collapse wasn't complete without Gerald. The exposés about his past labor abuses had sparked outrage among worker unions and immigrant rights groups. Activists marched with placards outside the Mason mansion itself, chanting slogans that transformed the once respected patriarch into a symbol of exploitation. The government opened inquiries. Old cases, once forgotten, resurfaced with vengeance. Names of men and women lost to anonymity in the factories of the 1980s suddenly reappeared, their families demanding reparations. Sponsors withdrew, political allies ghosted him. Awards he once proudly displayed were rescinded. Gerald Mason, the man who had sneered at Claire's little projects for years, now sat alone with everything he'd built turning into dust. All the while, Claire's star burned hotter. Her second book, written feverishly in quiet hours as scandal erupted, was poised for release, The Silent Empire: How Power Erases Voices. Without naming names, it dissected greed, corruption, and the crushing of the weak under dynasties of privilege. Critics braced for impact, certain it would ignite just as fiercely as her debut. But those close enough to read between the lines saw what it was, a blueprint of the Mason downfall, and Claire knew it. On talk shows, when asked about the parallels, she smiled knowingly. Sometimes art imitates life, and sometimes art reveals it. Her words fed the inferno. Christmas came colder than ever for the Mason family. The mansion, once radiant with glittering lights and catered parties, now stood dim and hollow. Photographers perched at its gates, capturing a dynasty's ruins. Eviction rumors circled as Gerald haggled to salvage what little remained.
But on Christmas Eve, Claire returned. By choice. She walked into the hollowed-out home, its chandeliers dimmed, silver sold off, laughter extinct. The once mighty table sat the same, but plates were mismatched, candles burned low. Gerald, Julia, and Evan looked broken, bags under their eyes, shoulders slumped. And then, like a queen inspecting her conquered court, Claire sat. "You wanted unity tonight," she asked softly, her gaze sweeping the three of them. "So here I am, the daughter, the sister you dismissed. How does it feel, losing the spotlight?" Julia glared weakly. "Happy? You've gutted us, Claire. Is that what you wanted? To see us crawl?" Claire tilted her head. "I wanted you to understand. Every time you shoved me down, every time you mocked what I built, every time you silenced me, I remembered. My revenge wasn't to destroy you. My revenge was to show the world who you really are." Evan's voice cracked. "You've turned us into monsters in front of everyone." Claire leaned forward. "No, brother. You already were. I just opened the curtain." Gerald tried to summon his old authority, but his voice faltered. "You think you've won, Claire, but the world moves on. Scandals fade. What then?" Claire smiled faintly, her voice calm, steady, irrevocable. "Then I'll still be standing, and your names will remain etched not in glory, but in shame.
History remembers truth longer than it remembers wealth. They fell silent. For once, forever, it was she who held the floor. Claire rose, collected her coat, and walked from the house without another glance. The snow outside glowed pale under streetlights, and she inhaled the sharp, clean air. Behind her, the house of Mason crumbled, not brick by brick, but pride by pride. And ahead of her stretched a future entirely her own. By January, the Masons as the world once knew them no longer existed. Julia's law career was gone. The state bar's ruling became final, suspension turned into disbarment. She walked out of the firm she once dominated for the last time, carrying a single box with hollow eyes. She vanished from headlines as fast as she had once chased them, retreating into penthouses stripped of luxury, curtains drawn against photographers still curious about her spiral. Evan faced indictment. Prosecutors pursued him fiercely, dragging investors and city officials into courtroom battles that promised to last years. Every day he appeared in the courthouse, looking smaller, grayer, less like the brash mogul who used to sneer at Claire's tiny salary. And Gerald Mason, the patriarch, sat in disgrace. Once courted by politicians, he now fumbled under congressional hearings. His empire was liquidated, his mansion mortgaged, his influence evaporated. Old men who had once raised their glasses to his name now shook their heads, whispering, "A fallen king," before moving on. The Mason empire lay in ruins. Claire had done it. From her Brooklyn loft, Claire stared at the city skyline with both triumph and emptiness. Her second book topped the lists just as predicted, her speaking tours sold out, and whispers floated about a Pulitzer nomination. She was everywhere, in classrooms, in living rooms, in coffee shops where strangers underlined her words like scripture. For the first time in her life, nobody overlooked her. Nobody dismissed her. She had demanded a seat at the table, and now the whole world leaned in to listen.
Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, Triumph carried a strange silence. Her phone buzzed constantly with emails, but rarely with voices she loved. She lived alone, her apartment immaculate, but cold. The family she once longed for, love, approval, connection, was ashes now. Whether she had burned it or revealed it had always been ashes, made little difference. When she dreamed, it wasn't of applause or interviews. It was of that birthday night, the moment she had stood to speak, trembling but determined. Back then, she had felt alive, righteous. Now she felt hollow. One gray February morning, Claire did something unexpected. She drove back to Connecticut, to the Mason mansion. The house stood like a shell, its towering gates rusting, its gardens barren, snow piled where once fountains had glistened. Protesters no longer stood outside. The frenzy had passed. Now it was simply ruins, a monument to decay. She let herself inside with an old key. The silence was crushing. Dust coated the marble floors, and half the light bulbs had burned out. Once, the mansion had been too bright, too loud, too grand. Now it felt forgotten, like a museum of hubris. She wandered into the dining room. The long table still stood, candles melted to stubs. She imagined the laughter that used to ring there, the laughter that had excluded her. She remembered the night she had risen to speak, her words cutting like glass. For a moment, she thought she heard the echoes of their voices, Julia's biting remarks, Evan's boasting, Gerald's smug drawl. They haunted in memory,
ghosts of people still alive but already buried by shame. Claire sat at the head of the table this time. And that was when she asked herself the question she had avoided for months. What now? All her life, she had wanted their approval. When it never came, she wanted justice. When justice wasn't enough, she wanted revenge. And revenge she had achieved perfectly, elegantly, ruthlessly. But what remained in its wake? Julia was destroyed, Evan disgraced, Gerald dethroned. But none of them had apologized. None of them had looked her in the eye and acknowledged what they had done. Even at the end, they had blamed her, hated her. Had she built her kingdom on ashes only to find it empty? For years, silence had been forced on her. Now silence came from choice, and yet it stung sharper than before. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A message. She pulled it out. It was from a university dean who had invited her to speak. "Ms. Mason, your words inspire our students. Thank you for giving them hope." Claire exhaled. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe revenge's purpose had not been satisfaction, but liberation, not only hers, but countless others. Maybe the runes of the Masons weren't the point. Maybe what she built beyond those runes mattered more. Claire stood from the table, walking its long, hollow length one last time. Her family had always believed power was the empire you owned, the titles you flaunted, the spotlight you controlled. She had toppled that illusion. Her power lay elsewhere. Truth, words, voices.
As she reached the front door, she looked back once, her reflection small in the distant mirror of the once magnificent hall. She whispered into the silence, not sure whether she meant it for her father, her siblings, or herself. "The seat is mine now, and I'll never give it back." And with that, she stepped into the snow, the house fading behind her into shadow, while ahead stretched a road, lonely, but hers. No longer the overlooked daughter, no longer the silent sister. Claire Mason, at last, had become the architect of her own table. The Mason family house looked alive that September evening, its brick walls glowing in the soft wash of fairy lights that draped across the front porch. Cars lined the driveway and spilled onto the suburban street. Laughter, the kind that rises like champagne bubbles, escaped through the half-open windows, carried on the cool autumn breeze. Inside, the dining room had been transformed into the stage of celebration. A 3-tier cake stood proud in the center, vanilla and gold with delicate roses carved from cream. Around it, polished silverware and crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier. It was a birthday gathering for Gerald Mason, the patriarch. 65 today, he wore the wide smile of a man comfortable under the spotlight, leaning back in his chair as relatives clustered around him like satellites orbiting a sun. But not everyone basked in the glow. On the far edge of the room, just beyond the circle of cheer, sat Claire Mason, his younger daughter, 32 years old, elegant in a navy dress, but deliberately placed at the end of the table. Her chair had literally been shifted away when more important guests arrived, leaving her half in shadow by the kitchen doorway. To the outside eye, it might have looked like oversight. To Claire, it was deliberate. This had always been the Mason family way. Claire, quiet, hard-working, the so-called average one, was destined to be overlooked. Her older sister, Julia, a corporate lawyer with her booming voice and showy wardrobe, was celebrated with constant applause. Her brother, Evan, with his real estate empire and flashy cars, was their father's pride. And Claire, the writer, the thinker, the woman who fought through setbacks the rest of them never knew, was always just Claire. On birthdays, weddings, and anniversaries, she sat like this, present but invisible. But tonight would be different. Claire tapped her fingers against the wineglass, steadying her breath as the conversations carried on without her. She overheard Evan boasting about closing another multi-million-dollar deal. Julia was laughing too loud, recounting how her firm had defeated rivals in court. Everyone drank, clapped, cheered. Gerald glowed with pride, nodding along with each story, his smile widening further. Then his eyes finally drifted toward Claire, as though just remembering she was there. "And Claire," Gerald said with a dismissive chuckle, "still working on your little projects, or what do you call it this time? Another essay or a blog?" The table erupted in polite, uncomfortable chuckles. Julia smirked. Evan concealed a laugh behind his napkin. Claire's jaw tightened, but her face never broke. "Yes," Claire replied calmly, lifting her glass. "Still working on my little project." She didn't need to explain. She didn't need their validation anymore, because tonight she had a plan. When Gerald lifted his glass to thank everyone, Claire waited until the clapping died. She let her fingertips rest lightly against the base of her wine flute. Then she spoke, voice calm, but cutting through the chatter like crystal shattering. "I suppose it's only fair if I make a toast as well." The room paused, heads turned. There were half smiles, the kind people gave when they doubted the speaker could be interesting. Gerald chuckled indulgently. "Well, if you must, darling, go ahead." Claire rose from her chair. All eyes reluctantly followed as she stood tall, the shadows falling away from her. Her navy dress glowed deep in the chandelier light. "For years," Claire began, "we've gathered around this table to celebrate each other's accomplishments. Julia with her legal brilliance, Evan with his financial empire, Father with his legacy of strength and authority. And me, well, in this family's eyes, I suppose I've always been something smaller." A ripple of discomfort passed over the table. But the truth has a way of demanding a seat at the table, even when some would prefer to keep it out on the edges. She let the silence thicken before delivering the dagger. "As some of you may know, or maybe none of you bothered to notice, I published a book last year. Not a blog, not an essay, a book." The air cracked. That book hit the New York Times bestseller list in 3 weeks. It has been translated into 4 languages. Universities are already teaching it this semester. And just last month, I signed an agreement for the film adaptation. Gasps punctured the air. Julia paled. Evan's mouth fell open. Gerald's smile faltered, brittle. Claire raised her glass. "So tonight, while we celebrate Father's legacy, I'll celebrate something else. That despite years of being dismissed, muted, and patronized, I've carved something of my own. Not for your approval, not for your applause, for me. And for anyone who has ever been told their place is on the edge of the table." She clinked, drank, and sat.